A wonderful afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you join us from. My name is Oliver Schmidtke, and I'm the director of the Center for Global Studies. When I'm in Victoria, at the moment I'm on sabbatical in Europe, but it's my great pleasure today to lead you through the discussion and to moderate our panelists. And, maybe just as a kind of context for today's event, today kicks off a series of panel discussions organized to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the European Community Studies Association. There's a range of events organized across the country from May 2nd today to the 11th. And you can find more details on the ECSA-C website. And this event is also part of our ongoing webinar series on memory politics, exploring how from a comparative transatlantic perspective, societies deals with past injustices and how historic narratives are being mobilized for political purposes. Hopefully, if COVID allows us to do so, this will culminate in a symposium in late October at Yekelchyk. We're grateful for both the German Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the European Union for providing funding for this exciting initiative. Now it gives me great pleasure to be here with you, leading you through the session entitled Justifying War Through History, Memory Politics and the Russian Invasion of Ukraine. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists, please allow me to share some brief introductory remarks. Many of you will share the thought that this war, which Russia has launched in Ukraine, is directly opposed to all the lessons that we have sought to learn from the destruction and exclusionary nationalism of the 20th century. As the General Secretary of the UN, Antonio Guterres, just recently stated, to witness a war in the middle of Europe with all its devastation and suffering seems absurd. Yet the bombs are dropping and the tanks are rolling, violating the fundamental sovereign rights of Ukraine in blatant ways. War would be great if you could mute your mics, that would be great. So wars require some form of ethical justification beyond mere power politics. And when listening to the justification produced by the Kremlin, we could realize that Putin was not just concerned with geopolitical security issues, NATO, the expansion of NATO, the alleged threat from the West, in particular America. These interests and grievances alone cannot really explain Russia's current actions. Rather, I think it is important to realize the pivotal role of Moscow's imperialist nationalist ideology. In this respect, it's worth noting that Russia's war against Ukraine has extensively been framed and defended by references to particular historical narratives. As early as 2005, in his annual State of the Nation address, Putin spoke of the collapse of the Soviet Union as the, and I quote, greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. An important testimony to his imperial historical policy is an article published in July 21 under Putin's own name, and how it was entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And in this article, Putin presents his historical political perspective according to which Ukraine, Belarusians and Russians are actually one people. Putin traces this unit back to the medieval Slavic rulers, and in his reading, history, Ukraine is an integral part of Russia's history and its culture and identity. The other use of history in justifying the invasion in Ukraine is a reference to the great narratives of 20th century history. For instance, the Soviet Union's Great Patriotic War and the fight against German National Socialism. The instrumental relationship of Russian leadership to the anti-fascist victory has always been problematic if you look into history, but yet Putin's current claim to pursue the so-called demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, this instrumental use of anti-fascism has taken on an almost absurd meaning. Essentially, it justifies nothing other than the ambition to remove the current Ukrainian government. In one of his key speeches on the conflict in Ukraine, Putin referred to the memory of June 22nd, 1941, the day of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, which is still very much alive in the collective memory of Russians today. He talked up a threatening situation for Russia and equated the Ukrainian government with the Ukrainian collaborators of the Second World War. And I think we have seen today another set of comments by Foreign Minister Lavrov. I don't want to go into this. It just gives you a sense of how deeply the justification for the war is steeped in history. But rather, instead of me continuing with these examples, let me turn to our panelists and introduce those to you. First of all, we have Dr. Lyubov Zhyznomirska, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at St. Mary's University. She completed her PhD at the University of Alberta in 2012, and in 2012-13, she was a Jean Monnet Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute in Florence. And Dr. Zhyznomirska joined St. Mary's University in 2013. And after this, she has been in Canada looking primarily at European Union's foreign relations in general and migration relations with its Eastern European partners, specifically Russia and Ukraine in particular. She has a particular interest in EU migration and asylum issues, both in terms of policy formation, but also politics. And then we have our UVic, Dr. Serhy Yekelchyk, who received his BA from Kiev University and MA from the Ukrainian Academy of Science, and he came to Canada in '95 to pursue a PhD in Russian Eastern European history at the University of Alberta, focusing primarily on Stalinist culture. He joined in 2001 the University of Victoria. Dr. Yekelchyk has worked in different dimensions on the social and political history of Stalinist period, as well as formation of a modern Ukrainian nation from the mid-19th century to the present. He has written a very influential book on Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation, that was published in with Oxford University Press in 2007. And more recently, a book, Ukraine, What Everybody Needs to Know. I think this book will sell very well in second edition now, also with Oxford University Press in 2020. So thank you both very much for joining me. And I would like to let you know how we would like to proceed is we first going to engage in a discussion with our two panelists here. And then after roughly half an hour, I give you the opportunity to join us either by leaving a comment in the chat function or by raising the hand, and then I bring you in. In the meantime, it would be great if you could keep your cameras off and also mute your microphones. And what I thought is, we start off with a very rather short introductory remark by both our panelists to reflect on the use of history in the current war launched by Russia in Ukraine and its political purposes. What is driving some of the historic narratives that I briefly alluded to in my introduction. And Lyubov, if you're going to kick us off this afternoon or this morning, depending where you are. So thanks very much for joining us, Lyubov. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Oliver, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. As Oliver mentioned, I am an associate professor in political science at St. Mary's University. I have our main building in the background. And so I share alma mater with Serhy Yekelchyk. I graduated from the U of A, but I arrived 2 years before he left. In my short introductory remarks, I would like to focus on the dimension of political state making in Russia and expression of the current understanding of current war in Ukraine as a stage in its state making project. And so I'll start quickly with a question of why now. For me, in my understanding, it's a very generational response of why now. The elites that are around Putin are of a certain age that and are at a certain stage when they are looking for a new person to potentially replace Putin. And so the answer of why is a combination of events and circumstances, but it also is very much linked to the generation of those in power who seek to reincarnate the Soviet Union in its glory in its past. So I would like to mention that contemporary nationalism is viewed as a modern phenomenon, with about 300 years in development, emerging at the intersection of capitalism and the intervention of print press. So I'm going to go with a structural explanation of nationalism, and we'll mention Benedict Anderson's understanding of three paradoxes of contemporary nationalism as in imagined communities. It's a very modern phenomenon, but many people think of their nations as ancient and eternal. History is always interpreted and reinterpreted. Historical monuments serve as an important role in maintaining the national narratives of unity and glory. Nationalism is viewed as universal, but at the same time, each nation imagines itself as distinctive. Nationalism is powerful, so that people are willing to die for their countries. But at the same time, it is hard to define what it is. So national identity is inherently political. It binds people together through common political aspirations, expressed through self-government and sovereignty and equality. And nations imagine themselves as a group that desire self-government through independent state. In political terms and international relations, this principle has been entrenched with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the right for self-determination after the World War II, which led to the anti-colonization movement and the establishment of sovereign states on the African continent in the 60s, right? So from this perspective, nationalism is understood and can be analyzed as a process of state-making, or building a political community within boundaries of what is recognized as their sovereign state. This perspective allows us to see the current Russian war against Ukraine from an angle of Russian elites acting upon their conception of a next stage in the development of Russian statehood. It has both internal appeal, as a consolidation of power, as the renewal of political economic principles for the Russian state, as a search for new political economic model that Russia can provide for its population and switch to the oil resource dependent economy that it has. But it also is ruled by the reactionary elites. Right? In 1999, the Russian elites allowed to come to power for Putin, and history has been appropriated by Putin's regime to glorify the past that fits into the narrative of Russia's glory. Putin's regime has reincarnated Stalin, and all his atrocities against the people have been silenced and shelved. If we think about the enemies that Putin presented in his speech before he recognized LNR and DNR in their status, he mentioned, of course, Gorbachev as a leader who led to the dissolution of the USSR, but he also mentioned Lenin as a leader who is at fault at giving too much room for self-government to the republics, to give too much room to the bourgeois, nationalist bourgeois elites, was the terminology Putin used in his speech, for them to prosper, right? So what is also apparent from analyzing Putin's speeches is that the Soviet republics remained, that were mere administrative units of the Soviet Union, continued to be perceived as such by Putin after they gained independence. Favorable economic relations, cheap gas, investment into these republics was the things that Putin mentioned in his speech, which he saw as a continuation of Soviet-era dependencies, the politics of creating dependencies in order to hold these territories, mere territories, that in rhetoric they sometimes recognize Lavrov and other elites, they recognize as being independent state, but at the same time, they do not recognize their right to be independent. So for some of the explanations have been provided to say that failure to nurture fifth column of pro-Russian elites, failure to weaken the state apparatus in Ukraine and create a system of further dependence, pushed Putin to take this, last stand and launch the war. The war thus can be viewed as instrument of power concentration of territory that imperial ideology views as its realm of rule. So Putin's role has turned into reactionary ideology, and I think for Ukrainian scholars and Ukrainian politicians as well, many aspects of the Russian state ideology and imperialist stretch into country Ukraine has been visible not only since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, but earlier. There was, I think, certain disbelief that this could be true, that there's not a politicking on part of Ukrainians. And so the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has made visible to everyone who wants to pay attention certain aspects of state ideology in Russia that are totalitarian in nature, that are imperialist in nature, but perhaps with signs of the 21st century tools of propaganda and control over the society. So I just want to remind certain stages in Russia's case. So United Russia emerged in 2004, 2006, consolidated as a political party to support Putin's rule. It squeezed out political competition, restructured political elites around Putin, and completely pushed out any liberal element in the Russian society. The creation of the youth wing party nurtured the next generation of loyalists to Putin. People who are now under 27, if we take 5 years old, people not think in political terms, children before 5 and don't imagine themselves. So we have a generation of young people who never lived in Russia without Putin. Sports such as hockey and soccer has served an important avenue to glorify the nation and reincarnate the might and prestige of the Soviet Union. There was a lot, when I was in Moscow in 2008, that the air was filled with the Soviet symbols, reincarnation of the Soviet anthem for Russian, for the state, for the new state. We also can talk about the cultivation of a father figure for millions of Russian men, young and old, that Putin has presented himself. It's also was accompanied by mobilization of xenophobic elements of the society. Think about Crimea annexation, the role of bikers and gangs in mobilizing society to support the annexation of Crimea. What is also important to mention is that annexation of Crimea was accepted, similarly as the war in Russia continues to be accepted by many elements of the society. And yes, we can think about whether surveys produce true results that reflect the views in the society. Perhaps we should pay attention to Russians fleeing their state and landing in Armenia and other states. But these people are in very much small numbers. And so the surveys continue to return the high level of support for Putin regime after the war started. The review, and it's anecdotal, it's not comprehensive, but the conversations that are released by the Ukrainian state through the surveillance technology point to as a matter of day conversation between Russian soldiers and their parents, wives, sisters, in how they perceive what is happening in Ukraine. What the war showed for the Ukrainian side is that we can see the Ukrainians themselves can see themselves as a political nation. It also showed that Ukraine has happened as an independent state. It has developed a civil society. It has created a system of political institutions that have shown capacity to govern in the times of war. There is a state And there are people who want to defend the state, who want to defend their choice to build the state they want. And they will squabble after the war, but right now they are united in their positions. What is also I wanted to mention briefly, mindful of time, is that 2014 and the Revolution of Dignity led to Leninapad, which for many Western observers may have been unclear, but Lenin signified the Soviet past. Decommunization that started in 2014 was not deep enough, and it was met with resistance. So current war has created further push to decolonize Ukraine from Russian influences. I will give an example of Kharkiv, which is a city with about 90% of the population being Russian speakers. Its mayor, which was perceived as very Russophilic mayor, have proposed last week to change any names of the cities, any places in the city of Kharkiv that remind them of a shared past with Russia. And because, as he was quoted saying, that having a Moscow city listed as one of the twin cities for Kharkiv is an offense for the city that has been bombed after the decisions were taken in Moscow. So we now are witnessing Pushkinopad in Ukraine, in the discussion, which is removal of Pushkin as a colonial writer and poet representing Russia in Ukraine, and the renaming of various squares and streets in Ukraine. And I will finish with a small anecdote. When the war started, a friend of mine at work, she works with a person from Mykolaiv, a city in southern Ukraine, and she came to her. She's from Lutsk, which is in the west of Ukraine, and the woman from Mykolaiv came to her and said, "I used to think that Bandera was our enemy, but I am called Banderivka now. He must have been a good person. Please tell me more about him." So this is where various parts of Ukraine are finding themselves in this stage of rethinking the past and looking at the propaganda that we are witnessing now as an illustration of previous generations telling us about Russian troops present and presenting propaganda against resistant fighters, against those who were trying to establish independent Ukraine in the 20th century before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lyubov. Over to Serhy.
Well, it's very easy for me now to follow up on what Lyubov has said, because she has built a wonderful theoretical foundation for the more detailed discussion of how historical memory is mobilized in this conflict. And perhaps one good place to start would be to say that media very often presents Mr. Putin as a person trying to reconstruct the former Soviet Union. And this is to a degree true, because indeed he is known as a person who felt that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century and such. But I think the war on Ukraine revealed the fundamental ambiguity of the Russian position. And we have many other indications of this ambiguity. But of course, the clearest indication in the case of the Russian assault on Ukraine is precisely the rejection of the idea of Ukraine as a separate nation, and refusal to acknowledge that Ukrainians constitute a separate ethnic group, but rather the Russian regime sees them as part of the same people with ethnic Russians. And this is very curious in a variety of telling ways. It was not the Soviet Union which insisted on Ukrainians being part of Russians. Rather, it was in fact the Russian Empire before 1917 which promoted this view, and in order to persuade Ukrainians to accept this view, the Russian Empire had banned the publication of any works in the Ukrainian language. So here we have a curious combination of features from two imperial pasts. One which is more modern, which was a great power, in which, of course, the Russian authorities really like Stalin, and the own version of World War II, which is in many ways just unbelievable version. But they also like the other past. They like the Imperial Russian past from before 1917, and everything bad gets blamed on Lenin. It was Lenin, as Mr. Putin keeps repeating, who had created Ukraine by artificially detaching historical Russian areas from Russia. But of course, the irony of this is that there have been numerous news reports last week, as a matter of fact, about the Russian authorities in the occupied parts of eastern and southern Ukraine, in the south in particular, restoring Lenin's statues. So how would that fit really with the fact that Lenin is responsible for artificially creating Ukraine? Lenin, of course, is not revered in Putin's Russia. Even so, a great many Western leftists somehow believe that Russia is wonderful because it is anti-American. The reality is that Russia positions itself as the extreme right Christian regime. That's the official self-identification of Mr. Putin's Russia, as the only true Christian conservative regime. So he is much far to the right, even from Trump, really. And yet somehow manages still to be admired by a significant number of, I guess, naive Western leftists. And so then Lenin totally doesn't fit. In fact, Mr. Putin's sympathies are on the side of the whites, either in the Russian Civil War. He is known for, bringing flowers to the grave sites of prominent white generals who were defeated by Lenin's and Trotsky's Bolsheviks. And then it suddenly becomes clear that it's an enormously hybrid concept here, because in Ukraine, the Lenin statues have evolved, as Lyubov has said, and I completely agree with her, has evolved into a symbol of the Soviet past. And the Soviet past itself became the symbol of something good. And that was the result of the propaganda in the southern and eastern provinces of Ukraine, when they were dominated politically first by the Communist Party, and eventually in the 21st century by the Party of the Regions, which preferred not to make too many promises. And that was the problem with the communists, because it's difficult to be, even a shame communist without promising something in terms of social reform, welfare and such. But of course, nobody really wanted to do that, of those oligarchs funding the Communist Party of Ukraine. And so the Party of Regions basically got rid of this rhetoric of equality and socialism and welfare, but instead kept one particular element. And that was the alleged defense of the Russian culture against the evil Ukrainian Nazis. And Lenin then became, for pro-Russian political activists in this part of Ukraine, the symbol of unity with Russia. That's how that happened. Because the irony is, on the Russian side, nobody sees Lenin as a symbol of anything. But we should not be surprised, because it's exactly the same with the image of the Donbass, the region in which the heaviest fighting is taking place as we speak, and where the largest civilian casualties and sufferings are being inflicted by the Russian army and the Russian government. But of course, the Donbass was justified in its existence as a separatist controlled by, in reality, Russian-sponsored and protected region, with Soviet mythology of the great industrial heart of the Soviet Union, the coal-producing region, where the working class people were always firm and always fighting against whoever, against everybody, really. Problem is, the region of the Donbass is actually split between Ukraine and Russia. There is also the Donbass on the Russian side. While on the Russian side, the extremely oppressive version of state capitalism, which Mr. Putin practices, in fact, resulted in the total closure of all mines and the firing of all the miners. So on the Ukrainian side, the Russian line is, we need to protect the miners of the Donbass. The miners are the people who are going to fight the Nazis, get mobilized as the true miner. On the Russian side, all of them are gone. There are no jobs. You either are in the police or in prison or whatever, or you enroll in the army. It's a completely depressed region. And that, of course, brings us back to the second point. Not only it is a highly hybrid model of memory and adjusted to a variety of Russian concepts, but also the model which is applicable in Ukraine as well as in Russia, while rejecting the reality of the Russian life. And so the Russian media, sometimes you can hear that the Russian media has one line for the outside and the other line for the internal consumption. But that's not true. I do read the Russian media every day, not because I want to do it, but especially now during the war. And it is entirely consistent with what the Russian government, of course, produces for the outside. It ignores the reality of life in Russia itself completely and misrepresents the Russian life. And yet, this is precisely the line which the Russian population is buying. And one important reason why it is buying is that it is based on previous, pre-existing, firm historical mythologies with continuity built into them, no matter how heterogeneous and hybrid they are in the actual functioning. So let me step back to my argument that some of them come from the Soviet Union and others come from Imperial Russia. So the Soviet Union has left the mythology which is widely accepted without being questioned in Russia now, and it's based not really just on the Nazis, quote unquote Nazis, but on the notion that the NATO was somehow a Nazi entity which had always wanted to invade the Soviet Union and revise the results of World War II. So in the Soviet Union, then, the understanding that the Allies were on the side of the Soviets was somewhat suppressed. And if you read the Russian media today, you won't believe your eyes, of course, but the Russian media openly says that the West is behind the Ukrainian Nazis. Therefore, the West is also Nazi. And in fact, the Russians probably think by now that the Americans were fighting on Hitler's side in World War II. That's entirely logical. If the West promotes Nazism in Ukraine, if the NATO is the successor of Hitler's plans against the Soviet Union, here you arrive into this version of history. And it is powerful also because the mythology of World War II was promoted by the state in a very smart ways, especially with the recent tradition, relatively recent tradition of the Immortal Regiment, when the Russians are made to march with portraits of the relatives who fought in World War II. Even so, there appears to be some state coercion and some fake portraits and such, but it seems that this tradition actually worked, and what it did was not building the memory of World War II as, a tragedy, a conflict in which we need to remember the victims, but which actually transferred to Mr. Putin's regime the credit for the Soviet victory represented in a very Soviet way as the victory of the mighty state. The Soviets, of course, didn't want to talk about the civilian casualties, even about the specificity of the Jewish tragedy. The Jews were subsumed under the category of innocent Soviet civilians. And of course, Russia today still denies the mass rape of German women in the Soviet-occupied Germany. Every time something published about it, the Russian ambassador sends a letter to the newspaper in the country saying that this is completely false, it's a fake. And so this concept of rejecting anything as fake very much carries over into this conflict. And then, of course, there is a second component. And I'm getting close to the end of my introductory comment, but I'm a historian, so I can promise several times that the next comment is going to be the last one. And the second component is, of course, that in Imperial Russia, identity was defined not really by ethnic background at all, but rather by belonging to the same religion. And therefore, Imperial Russia never developed any modern understanding of the Russian ethnic nation. It never really educated Russian peasants in being Russians, never mobilized politically even the Russian peasants. It prevented the Ukrainian peasants from thinking of themselves as Ukrainians, but it also didn't propagandize the Russian identity among the Russians. And that's because the identity present there was that of Orthodox Christians, based on the Eastern Orthodox religion. And that identity, of course, never fully disappeared. The Soviet Union really kept it going by saying that, you know, even so, the Belarusians and Ukrainians are separate ethnic nations, but they are the closest fraternal nations of the Soviet Union to Russians. But that really was the same triad of the Orthodox Eastern nations that constituted the heart of the Russian Empire. And so then, the Ukrainian separation threatens the Russian idea at a variety of levels. Russia never developed a modern ethnic identity. Russia never came to terms with its imperial past because it has always been the empire up to now, and today, of course, too. So the presence of separate Ukraine threatens the concept of the Russian Empire, threatens the concept of the Russian nation, which is in itself undeveloped. And as Lyubov has indicated very rightly, it threatens also the concept of Mr. Putin's authoritarianism because of the recent Ukrainian revolutions and the proven really desire of Ukrainians to fight for the vision of their political community as oriented towards Europe. Admittedly, mythologized Europe, but Europe still. The Europe of democracy, the rule of law, absence of corruption, equal economic opportunity, and such things. So multiple threats, all of them emanate from Ukraine. It doesn't really matter who is in charge of in Ukraine. This person must be a Nazi, as of course, Mr. Lavrov disastrously explained in his interview today, which is already making waves. I'm done. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Serhy. It's, you know, listening to you realize, you know, Lyubov started off by using Benedict Anderson and creating a sense of national identity. You know, what a patchwork of different traditions that seem to be also incoherent, you know, that currently define how Russia tries to define itself as a nation and justify its imperial aspirations, right? You know, I look for some coherence, but, you know, as an historian, you know, you think like, it's very interesting how instrumental the use of legacies can be, right? Even though, you know, it's often, you know, you scratch your head and think, how can these elements fit together? Lyubov, do you have an immediate reaction, you know, considering that you come from a social scientific perspective, trying to understand, you know, I think one dominant theme in what you described, Serhy, in particular, is the need for an enemy, right? And, you know, as we know, the national identity is always binary. It is us versus them, right? So, you know, it is constructed through these narratives of who we are, who the others are. And they are often depicted in very dramatic ways as enemies, as an existential threat, as so often we hear from Russian representatives at the moment. Lyubov,
yeah, thank you. I'm going to build on what Serhy mentioned about the hybridity in the Russian narrative of its own identity for this, because there's no coherency. And what is the hybridity? I lost my train of thought because I was trying to pull various things the enemy, right? So I think what emerges in the war, that it's not Ukrainians who are the enemy, it's the Nazi Ukrainians. And this seems to be like, you know, kind of rejection of that portion of the society that is supposed to be, you know, not us, but the rest are us. And I remember about 2 weeks into the war, some of the key propagandists like Solovyov and that's the person representing Russia today, they were talking about, well, they must have spread around their ideas into society more widely, because it's not just the elites and it's not just the Zelensky, but it's regular people who are very nationalistic. So I think the enemy is not that clear. There was a reference to the Ukrainian question for the Russian state in kind of solving this problem of Ukrainians who since early 19th century at least have shown the signs of the folk nationalism that was projecting against the official imperial nationalism within Russia, right? So then the Ukrainian question becomes not a creation of the enemy, but creation of a very specific group within Ukraine. And as Serhy pointed out, somehow that element becomes associated with the West and with the NATO, and is hybrid again in that creation of the enemy. So the enemy is the West, the enemy is militarized, but it's not the whole country, because for the country they want to occupy and make part of their own, they have to have a different solution. But it's also I wanted to point out is the role of Muslim identity for the Russian identity and the playfulness that Russia has expressed, projecting itself as very traditional, protecting traditional values, standing against LGBTQ plus rights that the West represents, and using Chechnya in a very instrumental way to say we cannot allow LGBTQ rights because their religion is going to, we're going to create a situation they will be killing each other, but also we have to respect their religion. So there's this ambiguity in dealing with Muslim identity through sexual orientation lens that is used to project geopolitically in positioning themselves against the West. And the third element is indigenous groups within Russia. What is emerging through the war, there was a public statement made by Euromaidan SOS, I believe over the weekend, about at the United Nations. There was a speech made about the level of loss that is experienced by indigenous regions, especially like Dagestan, and the level of destruction of culture, of languages by those groups that are viewed as being civilized by Russian. So there's a certain perception of Russian nationalist identity, and it's not just a state, it's a popular understanding as well. I've seen some research interviewing Ruskiye, those who are identified like Russians, not Россияне, but Ruskiye, which means like ethnic Russians, that they project their own civilizational mission on other groups that only become equal when they are fully Russified, right? And so this, like all this complexity was their own internal understanding of national identity and who they are as a state that are becoming like way more visible. And Putin, unfortunately, decided to use the war to give answers.
I look at the watch, we have a bit more than half an hour, so we would like to bring in some of you around the virtual table here who might have comments and questions. But while you might think about your question, you can either put it into the chat or raise your hands, and then you can pose a question yourself. I think one important thing, Lyubov, that you just mentioned is the sense of civilizational mission, right? Yeah, that we hear from the Kremlin. It's one thing is to be geopolitically feel threatened by NATO, by weapons that move closer, right? The NATO expansion and all this. But there's an underlying sense of a kind of almost a cultural war against the West that is relatively new, at least, from Putin. If you listen to what he said, in the first probably 7-8 years of his reign, it sounded very different. But now I think the anti-Western rhetoric has become one of the fundamental building blocks, right, for how he defines Russia, its aspiration, and also its justification to intervene in Ukraine, right? And that is, the decaying West, and we are really the future. It's only Russian people that can rescue the civilizational mission that we have as Europeans, right? It's, but you can imagine, once you embark on a civilizational or culturalist quest, then it becomes very hard to find compromise, because it is a fundamental identity that is at stake. It's not about, how can we try to collaborate, but it's really who survives. And I think this kind of almost Darwinistic sense, it comes to play and seems to be a justification for warfare now in Ukraine. So anyone, or Serhy or Lyubov, we can continue until we hear from you. So let's do it like this. So, and then Lyubov quickly, and then back to Serhy, and then hopefully we have one of you joining us.
I'll give turn to Serhy because I spoke quite lengthy.
Serhy. Yeah, very quickly, reflecting on what Oliver has just said, indeed, when this sense of a civilizational mission really interferes in a significant way with the early ideology of the Russian authorities of returning to Europe in the 1990s, the early 90s, when Russia wanted to see itself as a democratic country which destroyed the oppressive empire that was the Soviet Union. And of course, this sense is completely gone by now after Mr. Putin's interventions. And an interesting thing which also I think we need to mention is So Lenin is presented then as a European, and that is really bad. And also as part Jewish, by the way, which is also, of course, a suggestion here. And in yesterday's Komsomolskaya Pravda, of course, just breaking through all the records of what you can possibly do in history, blaming the creation of Ukraine on Lenin's having a sexually transmitted disease. That's like goes, really beyond any previous achievements of Soviet and Russian historiography in the empire building. But of course, that whole thing with Lenin being European, being really Jewish, and being whatever, having syphilis, and all of that somehow producing Ukraine, once again, with reference to how Russia constitutes itself with the help of Chechnya as a kind of conservative religious regime in a very interesting way. It's really aimed at excluding Stalin. And so Stalin is a big name in the background of this conflict, which does not get mentioned for a good reason. And that's because the Russian authorities lionize him as a person who single-handedly won World War II and created a nuclear power and showed the West its place, demonstrated to the West that the Soviet Empire is equal to the West, or perhaps even stronger. That, of course, necessitates a total erasure of various things. The Lend-Lease program during World War II, for instance, extremely minimized, if mentioned at all in Russia today, but also that is a Stalinist terror. The monument to the victims of the Stalinist terror was opened very late in Russia. In 2017, Mr. Putin gave a short speech there, 30 minutes, and he never ever brought up the name Stalin. It was all blamed on the Bolsheviks, who, as you know, are Europeans, and based on ideas of other Europeans, also Jewish Europeans, managed to destroy the Russian Empire, really. So Stalin was protected from any association with that. So instead, he's associated with victory. And I think we can see right away that in order to be loyal to Putin, you must be brought up to love Stalin. And that's exactly what's happening, because the version of historical memory created in Russia is created with a view of what the current political system in Russia is. And that fits beautifully. And it's also kind of sanctified by the Soviet-style mythology of World War II, which excludes all the unnecessary pages. And of course, in Ukraine, it's exactly the opposite, because in Ukraine, the foundation of national memory, especially in the 21st century, is the notion of the Holodomor, the genocidal famine, which was engineered by the state in 1932-33, in order to crush the Ukrainian political nation created by the revolution, in order to crush the Ukrainian peasantry, and also the intellectuals being arrested and executed at the same time. And well, and that brings us to the point which really separates the people fighting on two sides of the front. They still very often speak Russian, and they still have some cultural references in common. Also, as Lyubov has said, this process has started really, the reduction of common cultural references. But what truly separates them on a sociological pulse is the attitude to Stalin. Stalin still gets very high marks in Russia as one of the greatest historical figures, unless Putin is also included in the poll. Whereas in Ukraine, the opinion polls show very clearly that the overwhelming majority feels that Stalin was a tyrant, a dictator, and the Holodomor was a genocide of Ukrainians, seen as a political nation rather than ethnic community necessarily. And so here then is the biggest issue of historical memory, which almost never really gets discussed in the mass media. Also, I have been trying my best, and I'm sure you as well, Lyubov and Oliver, that the most perceptible difference between the versions of history found now in Russia and Ukraine is actually about the Stalin period.
And as I understand, there has been a systematic attempt to silence criticism of Stalin's methods in Russia, right, in history and in public events. And so it's not by accident, that we see the renewed reference to Stalinist periods in this respect, right? Do you want to quickly speak to this, and then we go to Rod's question about why now?
Yes, so I'm going to quickly, so the closure of any Hulag, any museums that have been talking about crimes of the Soviet regime, right? The persecution and closure of non-governmental organizations, like I forget the name, the Memory Society in Russia, like it's all labeling them as foreign agents, like this, the very systematic elimination of anyone who can provide an alternative interpretation of the facts, and not in a Trumpian way of alternative interpretation of, but kind of reveal the facts and show the history, show the atrocity of the Soviet Union. But I want to also mention about Oliver's comment about this, the choice of civilizational differences. And if we think about, I'll put my comparativist hat on, through the stabilization of regime, when Putin came to power, he was allowed to use the argument of stability in Russia prevails, the thinking in reforms, democratic reforms, right? So why I'm saying allowed, because he was in a way allowed by the European Union and by the Americans at that point, who were moving towards the common spaces of cooperation, modernization. By 2008, they were signed. It was this common spaces of cooperation between Russia and the European Union. The two sides got to the stage of equally funding anything they were doing in developmental projects in Russia. Why I mentioned this, because exactly at that same point in 2007, 2008, Surkov, came up with the idea of managed democracy, right? Of alternative ways of governing the people, representing the people, showing the legitimacy that is given by the Russian society. And so the path is a bit longer than 8 years, because it's about 15 years and it's probably even more, because 15 years when the ideas became public. And it was 2007 of Munich speech, when Putin came to Munich conference and said that, you know, the new world order is coming and security arrangements have to be renegotiated. No one took it seriously, right? Like, if we think about it, the Europeans said, well, this is nonsense. We're not opening up the Helsinki Accord. And also what happened after that is that when Lavrov published his work in 2007, where he talked about the new world order is coming, which is signified by the decay of the West and the new alternative that Russia will have. Right. And so Lavrov has been repeating all the things, and Putin's 1 hour speech before the war was putting all this like programmatically in one speech, which I was shocked. Like, I've heard all that before, but I was shocked because it was together in 1 hour speech with all the ideas in the same place. So it's been going a little bit longer. Thank you.
And that gives me the perfect segue into Rod's great question, right? Yeah, so as we know, to build a kind of historical narrative, right, it's over time, it evolves, and you need to even train new generations, you change educational institutions and so forth. But why now, right? What has triggered, the military intervention in Ukraine? Is it, are these two things decoupled? Is it a generation shift, or is it Putin's last stand, as some people say? He's getting up in age, right? And he wants to be remembered as someone in the legacy of the Russian Empire, as someone who has restored the pride and glory of this entity. So, is there any good, can we connect these long-term trajectories of building a new sense of collective identity and relationship to the West to the actual timing of the military intervention in Ukraine?
Well, it's a very loaded question in a way. I've been thinking about this, so I see a few things happening. So as I mentioned, generational elites trying to territorially finish the project of Crimea and have continental access to it, societal support for the finishing of this project, I think, in a way. It's a complicated question, but the other aspect is political economic model, right? So Russia, under impact of sanctions, has not come up with a creative way of maintaining itself economically and developing other parts than the European parts in larger metropolitan areas. So the war reorganizes the society, mobilizes the population, consolidates the economic power as well, because Putin has been now going after oligarchs who spoke against him, or a very small number of them spoke out. But yeah, so I don't know, I'll stop there.
Yeah, maybe there is no really coherent explanation, maybe this is opportunity, seeing Biden as weak and all those kind of things.
Yes,
after COVID, like we've read about this. Serhy, do you have any take on this question?
Elections. I will also mention elections. So elections in Ukraine and election in Russia that are upcoming, presidential elections in 2 years. I don't know if they will happen, but potentially it was supposed to be, 2-day affair.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with what has been said already, absolutely. There are all kinds of pragmatic and long-term and short-term reasons, in addition to those already mentioned. Putin, of course, reacted violently to the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity in 2013, 2014, but I don't think he was ready back then for a full-scale intervention. He was hoping that it would be enough to promote separatist insurgency with a small-scale operation of Russian secret services, and that would succeed in splitting the Ukrainian nation and creating a rump state, which is his aim anyway. But that didn't work out, and also the sanctions followed from the West. So I think the Russian elites realized that they need, before moving any further, to sanction-proof the economy to the degree it is possible. So there was a massive flight of Russian capital from the West back into Russia, which was encouraged by the Russian state. Preparations within Russia for potentially surviving long-term sanctions. They didn't expect on that scale, but they did expect on some serious scale. And as Lyubov has said, the presidential elections of 2019 in Ukraine, when President Zelensky came into power on a platform of ending the war, and basically the rejection, which was interpreted in Russia, I think, as the rejection of the more strongly Ukrainian patriotic line of President Poroshenko before him. So maybe they thought that, well, if Zelensky is elected, it means the Ukrainian society is not ready to fight. He's a weak president. Anyway, it's now that he is becoming a Nazi, but I think that was the calculation. That was the calculation that the 2019 elections seemed to indicate that the Ukrainian idea doesn't have a really strong support among the population, because of course the Russians see the Ukrainian idea in the terms of mid-20th century ideologies of, Hitler and Mussolini as ethnic, whatever ratio. But of course, the Ukrainian idea after the two revolutions in the 21st century is very different. It's a political community which is inclusive and defined by the notion of Europe more than any Ukrainian ethnic identity. And then, of course, Syria in 2015, I think, it was presented in the Russian media as a proof that Russia is strong and it can show the West its place. And I think in Syria, the Russian army also tried the ways of, using extreme firepower, attacking indiscriminately civilian areas. So there's some lessons of the military operation in Syria, possibly the disastrous Western withdrawal from Afghanistan very recently. So that it's combination of thinking that, Ukraine is a low dangling fruit, which can be grabbed, and the West is weak and disunited. And perhaps Russia has thought also that its influence within the European Union and the NATO countries is sufficient to block any decisive action by the European Union and NATO. And, I'm not a specialist on that. There has been some disunity, but I think overall, Europe has surprised the Russian elites in this respect.
as Lyubov knows, as a scholar of the European Union, it takes quite a bit to bring the European Union together and speak with one voice. You know, we see now with Hungary and the oil embargo, but clearly it has been, I think, a surprise, I think, for the Russians to see the resolve of something that was seen on the way out. NATO, right, might actually expand now yet again. You know, what you find in the media is also a discussion of whether the war on Ukraine is a sign of weakness or strength of Russia, right? You know, so it's because feeling threatened by exactly what you described, Serhy, a particular model of civilization, of nationhood that is more closely aligned to a mythologized, European ideal. We have seen this in Belarus. You don't hear much about, but I still remember very vividly. It's now 1 or 2 years ago. Right, this huge outpouring of protest against rigged elections there, right? You know, that was also, I think, a warning sign that for Putin to say, you know, intervention is needed, one form or the other. With Lukashenko, it was easier to basically have indirect influence, but Ukraine was definitely, you know, you couldn't let this go, right, you know, to a Western direction. And I think being threatened by a particular idea about democracy, civil society, I think is something that doesn't sit well with his authoritarian style. Is there any, or Lyubov here, I don't see any question, please go ahead.
I do want to mention the aspect of impunity, of not paying the price for serious price in the way of looking at the, like if we take Georgia, if we take support in Belarus as well, or before that it's Ukraine, annexation of sanctions were viewed as not, well, they were viewed as influential, but at the same time, European companies have found a way to work around the sanctions as well. So being internally corrupt, Russian leaders see the weakness in the Western leaders, right? So I also listen to, I cannot read because I find it infuriating to read Russian media, but I listen to interviews of the political elites just to see what they're talking, and in the level of disgust that Lavrov expresses towards the Western leaders and presenting them as being very corrupt and able to work with money and being able to be bought out with money, that comes through the rhetoric. So I think that's the impunity, but also complacency that Russians have calculated that they can rely on, but it didn't work because in some European countries, you have the mobilization of society to pressure governments to take different actions. Or we see somewhat painful process for Germany that it is going through, from, you know, realization of the impact of the World War II on itself, or the I know the discussion about not supplying weapons were accompanied by talking about we already use weapons in that territory, right? But now look where Germany is. So I think it's a very painful process on many sides that this war has produced, but I think that the level of not paying price for previous not mistakes, but previous actions in the foreign policy of Russia has led to this full-scale war, which with threats that Putin made, do not step in, because this is our territory, right? He can emphasize, he sent a message to the Kazakhstan and other countries saying that we're not gonna intervene in your part of the world, because, you know, we can control you well enough with the relationship we have. And so this is the narrative that comes through with calculations why it's now.
Thank you. We have another roughly 10 minutes. So if you want to raise a question, you know, you might want to think about it very soon. And but Lyubov, you'll ask for a couple of points. We could also do this conversation now thinking about framing, you know, the war in Ukraine through a Western perspective in terms of history being mobilized, right? And my background as a German, it's very, you know, palpable, right? How Germany struggles with its own role in the region, right? Its commitment to arming, you know, Ukraine. You have seen a lot in the media, but it must be painful in particular for kind of left-leaning government, social democratic, and the Green Party in particular, right? That's strongly tied to the pacifist movement, to the peace movement. Right now, they're pushed into a position of, in a way, radically rethinking what they have believed in for the past 40, 50 years, right? So it is, the German Chancellor spoke about a dramatic tide in the geopolitical realities of Europe at the moment. And it is definitely also a time for reevaluating some of the recent histories in the 20th century. You see this in the Baltic state, in Poland, right, where I'm based quite regularly now. It's, I think many of those things that we have come to think of as givens, right, are being questioned now. And it's fascinating time, but also a very painful time to live in, because it has real consequences we see almost daily on our television screens, right? But that is, I think, the period of the post-communist period has come to an end, and we see something new coming now, right? And that can be quite terrifying in terms of its consequences. Any comment, any other question from our audience? You don't need to be shy. You can also, if you have a question in a different language, I can see some my Italian friends here, so I can translate. That would be a problem. Okay, Jody, great. Could you please talk about the role of religion, especially in the interpretation of history? So we heard a little bit of, let me see, I didn't see the end of the chat. We heard a little bit about this from Serhy already, the Orthodox Church, that seems to, also be very much in favor of the war from the Russian perspective, but it also creates a cleavage within the Orthodox Church between Ukraine and Russia, I understand now, right? That because it's, the same Orthodox Church is in Ukraine. And so do you want to speak about this, as an important part of national identity and who people seek to, or claim to represent? Lyubov, or do you have your mic on?
I can make a very general comment, because I am a regular consumer of this. So if we think about Ukraine, it's multi-denominational. So that's important to understand. So there is Ukraine Orthodoxy and the Kiev Patriarchate, Orthodoxy and the Moscow Patriarchate. And the Kiev Patriarchate received its independent status within the church structure. I forget the correct term for that. And so what the war has revealed with the Moscow Patriarchy being an arm of the repressive, aggressive war by Russian was a Russian Patriarch speaking, blessing soldiers to commit atrocities in Ukraine, and rapes and all the killings we have witnessed. There is a natural move by church leaders, parish leaders in Ukraine, to separate themselves from that and to seek independent way and join independent Church of Ukraine that was received, the status that was received in 2018. So this, we are witnessing a new stage in separating the church from the Russian colonial project and its influences. And so Putin has used, he presented himself as religious person by visiting church, but he probably is not a religious person as such, using the church for instrumental purposes, again, as identity making on a more quantitative basis. As Serhy already mentioned, losing Ukrainian parishes would lead to Moscow losing that claim to be able to say that they are the largest Orthodox church in the world. And I'll stop at this.
Oh, yeah, I can add a few comments to that too. So there exists the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which received its autonomy from the Patriarch of Constantinople, the titular first among equals among the Eastern Christian churches. And there has been some movement of parishes as individual decisions of parishes. from the Russian-affiliated Ukrainian Orthodox Church to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is independent and connected to the Patriarch of Constantinople. But there hasn't been a flood yet. And the authorities and the Ukrainian branch of the Russian Church are navigating this process very cautiously, very carefully, really. A lot of parishes and actually some provincial eparchies, they stopped mentioning the name of the Patriarch of Moscow in prayers, which apparently can be done without a formal separation from the Mother Church, which is for them the Russian one. There have been voices. There have been a variety of voices in Ukraine actually about taking some measure to close down the Ukrainian branch of the Russian Orthodox Church because of its connection to the Russian, because of it being part of the Russian entity and thus part of the aggressor country. Now the President Zelensky administration is not apparently prepared to do that. And also turns out there is no legal mechanism for doing that, because the church is not registered as such in Ukraine, but rather 12,000 individual parishes are all separate legal entities, which is why they can transfer one by one if they want and when they are ready. And nobody wants to make such a move also because it would basically just contribute fuel to the Russian propaganda. So it's a fairly complex situation. There was a statement from the head of the church in Ukraine, from the pro-Russian branch, which condemned the war in general terms without condemning aggression. But I mean, other church figures have done that as well. And it's also a very popular position in Europe too. And I have to say, among the Russian intellectuals, we are for peace, because it would be difficult to say, it would be difficult to comment on the Nazi invasion of France by saying, oh, we are for peace in general, but here it somehow is still possible for now. So the church issue is enormously complex, and it probably is a fluid situation as well. And there are Orthodox Ukrainian churches, by the way, here in Canada, that are not related to either of the Orthodox churches in Ukraine, but ours is actually also under spiritual homophore, this is the term, of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So theoretically, going forward, there could be very interesting development in the religious world of Eastern Europe. This is something really to follow if you're interested in that or if you research that.
Lyubov and Serhy, thank you so much for drawing attention to the complexity of the issues and some of the driving forces behind what we see evolve in Ukraine at the moment. And I would like to close by citing you, Serhy, in an article that you wrote for Politico. You wrote the following: if you don't want to live in interesting times, as the alleged curse goes, best to avoid the parts of the world where heads of state write history treatises. So that is, I think, summarizes, what we see at the moment, the mobilization of historical narratives to justify war, conquest, imperial aspirations that clearly, have consequences on the ground, and it become very difficult to negotiate. And the lack of any move at the moment or peace negotiations that we hear about, right? It is quite astounding that there hasn't been much or talk about bringing this to a possible end. Seems to indicate the fundamental issues at stake, also in terms of the kind of civilizational mission, as we've been described in our discussion. So, Serhy, thank you very much for your time. I know your expertise is in high demand, and also I would like to send my sympathies, because you must have family and friends in Ukraine. And so, while this is a very academic discussion that we have, I think it is important to remind ourselves that what is going on in Ukraine is hard for us to fathom, the degree of destruction and just suffering of ordinary people as a consequence also of the attempt to rewrite history. So with this, I would like to thank our two panelists and all of you to have joined us today. And with this, I would like to bring this session to the end.